So I'm not going to belabor this. There are two slides. One, some more data for you. Content delivery networks will carry nearly 2/3 of internet traffic by 2019. So that means 62% of all traffic will cross CDNs, and globally up from 39%. Equivalent to 66 times the volume of the entire global internet in 2005. Will reach about 37 gigs per capita by 2019. This is the number of devices connected to IP networks will be more than 3 times the global population by 2019. It's kind of tricky. It would take an individual more than 5 million years to watch the amount of video that will cross global IP networks each month in 2019. Every second, nearly 1 million minutes of video content will cross a network by 2019. This is Cisco data, yeah? Globally, IP video traffic will be 80% of all IP traffic, both business and consumer by 2019, up from 67% in 2014. That's to set the stage if we're talking about over-the-top services. Now, first of all, I don't know who it, when you come up with a word or a definition like over-the-top services, it clearly means that you're trying to figure out a way to define something and put it into a cage maybe, so you can figure out what to do with it. I used to work for an operator, and I understand 100% where there's angst about network operators saying, well, the traffic is transiting my network. I'm just a transit point now. I'm not the originator of the content. In the European Commission, in the European region, more than 10 years ago, the European Commission said to the largest networks there, Telefonica, Deutsche Telekom, France Telecom, and Telecom Italia, BT wasn't involved, upgrade your networks, more content's coming, get it together. The network operators went back a couple years later and said, we want you to subsidize us. We want you to help us improve our networks. And the commission said, no, we talked to you 3 or 4 years ago about this. And they said, well, we're going to take it to the ITU. Well, that's the scary thing sometimes for some people, because it might land in a treaty. And so a couple of years ago, there was something called the World Conference on International Telecommunications, where this issue did come up. And it's the first time that the internet community has had to go to what they consider to be a telco world. I want to be very clear, we work very closely with the ITU on development-related issues, and we're partnering with them for an IXP workshop in the Arab states soon. But you've got a differentiation here between what used to be an old telecom world and regulatory practices, and what can be very concerning for internet community types who are trying to innovate more, do more. If you bind certain things into a treaty, that causes lots of issues. So just a quick 3 points for the folks on the webcast as well. So if you consider OTT services to be content that arrives from a third party, like Hulu or Netflix, are you guys using Hulu here? Netflix, yes. People are nodding their heads. So that's traffic or packets that are crossing an ISP network, right? It can be a mobile operator. I stream Hulu at home. I don't have a TV. I'm on the net every day, so the last thing I want to do is look at a big TV screen when I get home. But now I'm looking at a tiny screen on Hulu. I'm not sure what I'm doing to myself, but in any event. But if the ISP is transiting the packets and it's not their content, where do they stand? Do they want to be reimbursed? That's part of the issue. And I mentioned the wicket, where regulators and ministries had to take a step back and try and deal with a new term, because it's not defined in the ITU yet. There were big debates about this a week ago in Geneva, with some content delivery networks talking about this, and IXPs were getting mixed up in the debate. So where are you in this region? And that's where I'm going to turn it over to Carlton. But if you look at some of the companies here, you know that Amazon Prime probably is a streaming service. You've got YouTube. How many people look at YouTube on a daily basis, or at least once a week? Yeah. So do you want this to go away? And as government officials, if all of a sudden your population is saying, why is it really expensive now because you've created a different charging scheme for this, or you're regulating it differently, you could really end up into an interesting situation. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Jane. Carlton, would you like? You don't want to? Okay. Other questions? Let's first see if there are questions with respect to OTTs, and then I'll give Carlton the opportunity to say a few words. No?
Is there a regulation? We could ask that question.
Yes, there's one.
Oh, is there a regulation in place on it? Regulation here? Okay.
Do you have questions? John, would like to make a comment?
I think the subject of OTTs have been discussed quite a bit here in the Turks and Caicos. The last local conference it came up, and during our 10th year anniversary in November, also that was the topic that was discussed at one of the meetings. And it seems like that the matter of OTTs have been more or less resolved. I think the carriers have accepted the fact that they should not be blocking now. All right. Thank you.
So basically, what you say, we can just close this session and go to the beach? Ah, okay. Okay, I agree with you.
That's very good to hear.
Okay. Carlton, do you have some comments?
Well, I'm saying it's very good to hear, John. Maybe we should recommend the TCI's position to the rest of the region, because here's the thing: in the old days, you had different networks delivering traffic. So you had a network that was very specific to the payload. Now with IP, you have a single network delivering packets, and the interpretation of the packets happen at the end user interface. So it's just ones and zeros stuffed in an envelope. It gets transited, and it bubbles up to the application layer. Depending on the application you have, and all of the sense, all of the intelligence that is required to interpret the packets is at the end user level. So what we're talking about really, the issue is really the delivery layer. How you get it transited from the content provider to the user at the end. And Jane put up several, well, you see them there, several examples of it. The big ones we use because we are talking to people, we are very oral tradition in the region. It's communications, the ones that we use to communicate. Back in the day, we worked with a provider, said we make the things that make communications work. It's not so much anymore. There are lots of people who are making the things that make communications work. And so we have the WhatsApp, the Vibers, we have the Telegrams, we have, you name them, they're all over there. And it's working. The other big one, of course, is the content providers, because they're all IP-enabled services, using exploiting at different levels the business model that is preeminent in the internet economy, and that is advertising in use. And this is where most of the frisson, the heartburn comes from the various layers in that that stream. The question then becomes, well, if we are if it is delivery that is most important, and we have the highways, might we not be in a position to charge for transit? And the issue then becomes who charges. There are a couple of responses to it, of course. Some content providers have been persuaded to have agreements with the owners of the pipes for access to the pipes for delivery. Nothing wrong with that. It's the business proposition. In other cases, people are saying, well, you know what the content is, and a lot of the things that you use, who are the people who use Google here? Who are the people who read newspapers online? I rarely ever buy a newspaper. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post and Paris Match and even Jerusalem Post very regularly. I read Times of India very regularly because that's how you keep up with what's happening with the things I'm interested in. All over the world, and I do that because the internet allows me to access content that I would not normally have. So now you have a situation that says, well, if a lot of these content providers are publishers and content, and they're saying, well, if I monetize by advertising and you want to read my content and you block my advertising, I will not allow you to read my content. And that's one model. For example, the Springer Group in the European theater is very much into that. That's what they're saying, that they're encouraging their members to, if I detect a block from a user, then I will not allow the user to access my content. That's another model that works. So we have varying responses to the issue of why do you deliver across the network and what is in it for me? In the Caribbean, it's a little bit more involved for us because we are trying to, first of all, from the public policy perspective, we are trying to negotiate our way into social and economic development by exploiting the digital economy and access to the global economy. That's very important for us. Small groups, 33,000 people here, but if you have something that you can sell to 4 billion, even for a penny at a time, that adds up. It's numbers, about numbers. This is a numbers game, right? So each of us connected to all of us is a very important idea for us. So whenever you have any kind of response that gets in the way of each of us connecting to all of us, you need to look at it closely because it has downstream implications for all of us. The issue, of course, becomes even more acute because we have governments, as I say, who have been seized of the responsibility to potentiate economic improvement. And they have been doing some things right. So we have, our governments have been looking at young people and young entrepreneurs and helping them to develop access to the internet economy and digital economy. We've been trying to change the way we do our education by making more online accessibility and availability. We've been trying to change the content and the curriculum of our education systems by having a wider access to a whole set of instructions that we never had before. These are very important to the whole social and development polity. It's very important. And so these things are important. Most of these services that we are using to do things are what are termed over-the-top services. So we need to look again at the impact on our state and place. Very important. So now we get to the regulation. There has been some providers have appealed, as they should and as they would, as a business proposition, to regulators to take this up. And we are very glad that here you don't have that problem. Here's the thing. For the most part, the regulatory frameworks that would be used to address this issue is not fit for purpose. Simply not fit. It's the old regulatory regime that is in play, where the plain old telephone service, where voice services were universal access for voice services delivered a certain way was the regulatory objective. Let me give you an example. How many people remember this issue of bypass? Okay. All of us who are here, let me give you another practical example. There was a time when Jamaica accounted for the third highest amount of minutes out of the United States. Jamaica. You know what the population of Jamaica is? It's about 2.8 million. But back in the day, in the 1980s, we were under 2 million. And behind Ireland and the Philippines, Jamaica landed more minutes out of the United States than anywhere else other than Philippines and Ireland. Why was that? It's because of the diaspora. Diaspora. And here was what happened. The regime at the point had one gateway. So you had a spigot, and everything came to that point, and you could measure it, and you could sit there and collect. Well, that's not happening anymore because you have more ways to enter, and you're not using the same old networks to enter. And although people are talking to people as much as or even more than they used to talk to people, then this has changed. It has changed because of so-called OTT services. So here is the difference. We still have the need to communicate. We're communicating more than ever. We're also using that communication because of how it is delivered to us in more creative ways than we used to with the plain old telephone services. We are absolutely sure that what has transpired is good for our social and economic development. I started off by showing you how it was being used in education, how it is being used as part of government, e-government. Every single Caribbean government has a very well active e-government service. And all those e-government services are predicated on what? More online access for citizenry. And every single one of them use a so-called OTT services as a way to deliver that service. I'm making these points because you need to understand the breadth at which you have to look at the issue before you can decide where you settle on the issue. So that's the regulation. So we now know the regulation is old-fashioned, out of date. It is not fit for purpose. So here's now the issue. What do we do for those who say we are dying because of OTT? Well, it is not something to take lightly. And business disruption happen at all levels. And this is a major disruption of old business models, major disruption of all delivery modalities, all of these things. But the answer cannot be that you dispel disruption. The answer cannot be that you throttle every attempt at disruption, because it's out of disruption that innovation happens. And it is out of innovation that we will bring the next wave into being. Here's the thing with technology, and I'm a technologist, but I'm not so into the technology for technology's sake. I'm into technology for what it affords me, what I can use it to do, right? And that's what I always advise governments and regulators around the region. You have to look not at the technology layer, but at the user and consumer layer, and work your way in. If you start looking at the technology layer, you are going to become blindsided. You are going to be unaware of the broader set of issues that are happening at the edge. And that is where you need to begin to foster regulatory intent and the regulatory response. So, our charge to regulators simply this. As you look at developing regulatory frameworks in this new dispensation, issues of consumer access, issue of user access, issues that are in a wider public policy sphere, you need to examine those closely. This is something that is required. If you are going to attempt to regulate, and we certainly believe that at the most, the light touch regulation is the one you should embrace. You need to understand that there are a host of other issues that are involved. There are also companion issues. And my colleagues Jane, as well as Raquel, hinted at several of them, or spoke to several of them. Their data protection issues, their privacy issues, their freedom of expression issues. In other words, understand, impact these decisions. So this is the charge. If regulation is going to be effective, the breadth and scope of the issues surrounding that regulation must be closely examined, must be seriously examined for the balance that is required to emerge. And if you even think regulation is necessary because you think somehow you want to create a breaker for the disruptive forces of the technology, because the technology is always going to be disruptive, what you need to do is understand that you will be better positioned to take the light touch approach and be very mindful that the technology is always changing. The technology is always going to trump the next wave. And that is something that I would recommend.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlton. I think we can notice that Carlton is a lecturer at the university, right? So thank you very much.
There's a question at the back.
Question, please.
This is not really a question. I would just like to elaborate on a very short statement that John made about the fact that we've sort of dispensed with the consideration of OTTs in this jurisdiction. Carlton mentioned that regulatory regimes today in many jurisdictions do not fit the purpose anymore. Regulatory regimes were set in the days of fixed line telephony, perhaps. Certainly here we're still with a regulatory regime that was fixed at that time. So we need to communicate also, as Carlton has said, and we need to communicate in creative ways that now involve next generation networks and new generation networks, which are technology that wasn't even conceived at the time when we established our regulatory regimes. So when we looked at OTTs, we realized that our legislation just was not would not provide any ways of us any ways for us to deal with those matters, to regulate it, and unless we changed our regimes. But also, a very important point that was made: we didn't have anybody dying because of this. You see, that was not a concern. There were no providers that were about to die because we were not regulating OTTs. So perhaps this is what John meant when we said, having discussed it at length on several occasions, we did not feel that there was anything that we could do in this jurisdiction about that matter. So this is where we ended up. after much discussion, we concluded that we do need to change our regime. And we need to go into a regime that will enable us to deal with all the new technology and the new networks. And we certainly will consider, when we do make those regime changes, all aspects that will enable us to deal with the user and the consumer, and make sure that everybody using their machines will be able to have access to all of these things that we see on the board there. And I think that's what everybody wants to do. That's, I think, perhaps is all that John meant to say when he said we just put it aside.
Jane, would you like to comment on that?
Just one perspective as well on this. Regulators and ministries are struggling with this issue, and companies around the world. It doesn't mean that the regulator or the ministry is out of a job. It means you may have a new and different job to help enable the internet economy and the well-being of your own economy. I'm just thinking of what you do in this, and you've got a beautiful country. First of all, I think it's one of the nicest places I've ever visited for a workshop. Thank you very much. But if you look at the natural beauty of your island and the sea creatures, the fishing, you want to preserve your island. Yes, you don't want. And so how do you advance technology so it doesn't make it look ugly here? We have the problem where I'm from. I'm from a tourist area as well. It's in the Northeast, much colder than here. It's in a place called Maine. I don't live there now, but there's about a foot of snow. But
Beautiful
when
in the
mobile
summer.
towers went in, there was a huge nightmare situation in our national parks. They looked ugly. They made them look like pine trees, which you know what pine trees are. But the question is, with technology being developed, and particularly mobile technology, and this is particularly acute for Digicel, and I'm a big fan of yours, but I'm just saying it's a big deal for you. The mobile economy is huge and growing. So how do you advance your networks, and how do you figure out how to carry that content and stay in business, right? And expand your network. We may have some ideas on like connecting the next billion, where we could partner with you on some things, which are community-based wireless networks. But going back to OTT, I don't think you can't put content back in the bottle. The genie's out, right? Countries' economies depend on this now, and your governments also probably depend on getting that information out. And I should say, with the government services that Carlton mentioned, at the Internet Exchange Point, one of the key contributors to some of those networks are government networks peering at IXPs, because
Yes.
they can get the data out in the country without having to do a long-haul traffic route out and back for traffic. And so for them, it was a cost savings measure. So it is a huge balance that the country strikes with encouraging your economic development, preserving your cultural heritage and your country, but also, training the next generation, right? Because you've got kids, and you want to bring them along, and you want to also bring in tourists, because that helps your economy. But how do you do all of that at the same time? And part of it is public debate. And I used to be a regulator years ago in a place called Moldova. The first public forum we tried to have was like a huge fight. I thought they were going to punch each other. Some of the guys who are on the regulatory commission with the mobile operator and the fixed incumbent, because they'd never had a public discussion. So it was fascinating. It's complicated. It's never going to be easy. And IXPs, not easy. I mean, I make it sound easy when I'm up there talking to you. It's not hard to do technically. And I should have said, and this is unique to a lot of other network development as well, 80% of this is human engineering.
Yes.
20% is technical. If
Yes.
we had a switch, routers, gear, a server, maybe we don't even need that to get the IX up. We could put an IXP together here in the corner of the room.
2 hours.
2 hours, yeah, truly. Run some traffic, make sure we're exchanging and see what happened. Maybe a little BGP if people knew it. Many of you probably know how to do that. So the question is, if it's not that hard technically to do it, what is it that gets in the way? And how do you make it easier to make that happen? And there are steps to do that, and it's not new, but the thing is, you have your own unique system. You've got to figure out what'll work here, because we are very keen to make sure that we say we don't want to impose anything. It has to be part of what is unique and works here in your culture. and to the island. And this is in any country we go to. There are certain things you have to do technically, but then what is it you do to bring people together? Some countries, they don't drink alcohol, so in the Middle East, it's tea. Or they go out and they chat, you know, in a different forum. Here, you may get together over beers. And that's what a lot of people do. They sit down and just discuss technology as technologists and grow their infrastructure. Mark knows about this. The network operator groups are pretty famous for either being online and having good discussions or getting together. So whatever works. I mean, we're not telling you there's a dictated way to do it.
So let me bring up one thing that Jane says that you. How many of you notice when tourists come here? What's the first thing they do?
Check their phone.
Check the phones, right? And what's the first thing they look for when checking the phone? Wi-Fi. I will tell you, I will not stay in a hotel that does not have Wi-Fi available for you. I don't. I simply don't. That's rule number one. If you don't have Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, you won't get my dollar. Bye. So that's important. And you just have to use your eyes. The evidence of your own eyes will tell you how it's going. They come to the airport like I do, and the first thing you do, you take out your phone and you look to see if you got free Wi-Fi. Cable and wireless are the big thing in the Eastern Caribbean. All of the airports, they had free Wi-Fi in there. And everywhere else, cable and wireless was big. Some other places, people used to cuss them. But from day one, in the Eastern Caribbean, they offered free internet access in the airport. That's a big thing. They understood that. It drove their business. It drove their business. They understand the transit business. Let me give you another example. At the UWI, when I was CIO and University Director, we had two providers for bandwidth. We had Flow, when it was independent, and Cable and Wireless. We just did a redefinition of the network. Had a single point of presence and said, if you're going to offer me service, you come and terminate here. This is where you're going to terminate. So they came and terminate there. And you know what we did? We connected both networks to the BGP, and nobody complained. So I wasn't transiting traffic up to Miami to come back to the next faculty, which is just up the road from me. I wasn't transiting traffic. I had traffic from the University of Technology running through my network to that BGP route and saving everybody some transit time and saving everybody some bandwidth time. It wasn't public. It wasn't something that was anybody beat up the chest and said we did that. It was a simple business proposition. Listen, you're on that rack, on this shelf on that rock, you're on that shelf on that rock. There's two ports there. We're going to connect these ports. And we're going to exchange traffic right here. And it works. So they understand the principles. What you have to help them to do is understand the business proposition. And that is where it gets a little tricky, because you have to have people who understand what's coming ahead of them and where the road is going. It cannot be that they're just looking right there in the next quarter. They have to look within the next year, within the next 2 years, within the next 3 years. And that's what you have to encourage them to do. Look over the horizon, look long term, and see how they do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlton. I think if there are no other questions, let's thank them for this presentation, for their presentations. And we're going to take a 15 minutes break, and then we will bring this session to a close. Thank you.